Welcome back to Anatomy and Physiology here with your professor, Dr. Sean Clavel. Today we're talking about movement. And really, before we can talk about movement, we should really talk about where this movement occurs. And so we've talked in the previous chapters about how bones are relatively inflexible. So where we move is where these bones interconnect. This is referred to as articulations or joints. And each joint that we have reflects this dichotomy or this compromise that we have between stability and mobility. So the common examples I refer to are the shoulder and the hip. Your hip is a much more stable joint, and as a result, it lacks range of motion or mobility compared to your shoulder, which is much more range of motion, much more mobile. However, much more likely to sublux or dislocate. It lacks stability as a result. And so, mobility is often referred to as range of motion. The amount of physiological range of motion is a direct result of the anatomical structures. So your hip socket is much deeper, covers much more the head of the femur versus uh, the glenoid fossa of the scapula, which is almost like a golf ball on a golf tee, as I imagine it. The structure, it only maybe takes up a third of the head of the humerus, whereas the acetabulum encompasses almost two-thirds, three-quarters of the head of the femur. So it's a deeper socket. And then you have ultimately these ligaments that hold it in place. But as a result, again, that shoulder joint has much more range of motion, but the hip joint is much more stable. You're not as likely to dislocate your hip as you are your shoulder. And so that's the compromise that we see between stability versus mobility. And we see this throughout movement as well. And so first we'll start by classifying joints. And so there's two ways that joints are classified. You can classify joints based on their function. So that's what we'll talk about first. So the functional classifications of joints are related to how much movement or how much range of motion might be available. And so synarthroses, syn without movement, syn referring to without, and then arthroses, joint, so unmovable joint, right? So we have these synarthroses, which are joints that don't move. Think about the sutures of the skull. These are more of our fibrous joints. So the sutures of the skull, the teeth in your socket is also a fibrous joint. There are amphiarthroses. Amphiarthroses provide limited movement. So examples of uh, amphiarthroses are like our symphyses. So these are cartilaginous type joints. They're held together by fibrocartilage specifically. But again, you can see that the pubic symphysis provides for a little bit of movement, as is demonstrated during childbirth, and then a little bit of movement as demonstrated in the uh, vertebrae, right? The intervertebral disc. So both of these are joints that provide a little bit of movement. So they're referred to as amphiarthroses. And then finally, the type of joint that we'll spend most of our time looking at are these diarthroses, these freely movable joints. So the joints that are related to arms, legs, shoulders, hands, and legs are referred to as diarthroses. So all of these synovial joints are referred to as diarthroses. And so we'll spend, as I mentioned, there's a number of different types of synovial joints and the way that they move. We'll look at that in later in the chapter, but really, uh, the concept is that all synovial joints are diarthroses. They're freely movable. So all the joints that are related to movement are diarthroses. Then Kind of in closing here, generally, those fibrous joints are immovable. Synovial joints are freely movable, as we mentioned, but those cartilaginous joints, they have both rigid and slightly movable examples. So, as we'll look in the later chapters here, you'll see that there's uh, temporary cartilaginous joints like the epiphyseal plate, and those are not to move. However, we just mentioned about the pubic symphysis, and it does have a little bit of movement to it. So we're going to talk about the structural classifications, and then we'll talk about their functions as it's appropriate. So in our next sections, we'll talk about the different types of structural joints, about the different type of structural joints, the fibrous, those cartilaginous and synovial joints. And then you can see there's some asterisks in the functional because there is some deviation in terms of the synarthroses and the amphiarthroses, but you can see that all synovial joints are diarthroses. But we'll save that for another section as we talk about the different types of structural classifications, the different types of joints related to the what holds them together. So you can see at the top there the fibrous material or collagen fibers, whether it's a cartilaginous joint, whether it's held by hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage, and then synovial joints are actually uh, separated by synovial fluid. And so this is where there's actually a space between them.